Hey Ryan, how are you?
Very good, very good. And we're here with another episode of In the Spotlight. Today, we're starting a series of a few episodes specifically around cybersecurity value selling and cybersecurity value realization. And we'll talk with David Koppe from Sysdig about that specific topic. But before we start, I'd like to just make a quick introduction to David. David has been a long time executive with 30 years of experience. David, you've been part of amazing companies like GE, BMC Software, where value selling, sprouted to many other companies. One of them is Bladelogic, where you continue to, and then MongoDB as well. So amazing companies at hyper growth. I actually know quite a few people from those companies as well. I think we have similar circles there. And then for the last 8 years, you've been specifically focused on value selling and value realization at Sysdig, leading the VMO office, and specifically concentrating on how to understand business challenges of customers and quantify those challenges to be able to drive the value conversation. So thank you for being with us, David.
Thank you for the kind words in the intro, and looking forward to talking to you today.
All right, let's jump in. So before we start, let me just start maybe with a generic question. I like to get different answers to the same question. And what is value selling for you?
Yeah, so anytime I'm joining a new organization and sort of introducing them to the idea of what is this value consulting, value engineering role, I always sort of like to kind of get the audience's attention. And a lot of the times this is either sales or a mixture of sales and pre-sales, probably fairly technical people. And I like to say, guess what, folks, we don't sell technology, right? And I kind of pause a little bit because you get some funny looks, right? Like, who is this guy joined a technology company and says that we don't sell technology? But then kind of the punchline is, no, we make technology, absolutely. But what we're selling, the financial part of that transaction, is actually the value that technology is delivering to a customer. And I think as technologies become more and more pervasive and more people have become comfortable with technology, maybe it's just consumer electronics, but in many cases, it's just technology generally, with a much higher level of literacy. It's easier to sort of get caught up in that sort of wow factor, the cool factor of every software company out there has some unique thing, some unique intellectual property they're bringing to the market. And it's easy to get caught up in that and why it's different and how it's cool and how it's making a difference. But really kind of putting yourself on the other side of the table and saying, well, why should a customer give you money for this great thing that you purchased? And when I think back to my days at GE, I was that person on the other side of the table, responsible for managing and bringing in technology to support the business. That's kind of the question I always think to myself is, why should a customer, and especially in these economic times, why should a customer prioritize their very tight budgets to spend money on what we're talking to them about today? And that ultimately is value selling, getting to the investment that a company is making in your solution and what is the business value that they're going to get out of that. And the technology is merely the means of delivering that value.
And so you're basically talking about up-leveling the conversation from the technology to the outcomes of what the customer is trying to solve and trying to get. But that transition is not trivial. And so from the teams you've been at, what were the main challenges of making that transition in the conversation from selling technology to selling the value technology brings?
So it's a great question, and you're absolutely right. It's not a trivial transition, honestly. Otherwise, everybody would be doing it. I think that there's a couple of ways to think about it. I think as a technology company, you often end up working with practitioners, and their focus is very much on the technology. Right now, there are some technologies out there that are so disruptive that the value is inherent and implicit. And those organizations always feel like they're a little fortunate because they don't have to think about value in the same way. But for the most part, if you're working with a practitioner, in our case, a security practitioner, what they're focused on is, how is a solution like Sysdig going to make their life easier, help them do more in the same amount of time, maybe not constantly feel overworked, overstressed, getting a lot of noisy alerts that don't really contribute anything to the overall situation. And that's important. That's sort of the how you're delivering the value. But then again, to convert that into a value conversation, it's probably not that person that you need to be talking to. There's nothing wrong with engaging with practitioners. They're the ones who have the insights and the day-to-day experience of what security or whatever industry you're in is like in this organization. But ultimately, I always think, well, what would the CFO say, right? The CFO is probably not going to care about the intricacies of how my solution does something differently to the other 12 solutions that CFO could look at. And sort of the day in the life of the security practitioner is not really how that CFO is going to be making the decision. You need to think in different terms. Maybe it's tool consolidation. Maybe there's a whole bunch of other tools that you're using that in total cost more than this one solution. That's great. That's a value angle you can pursue. But I think increasingly, especially the type of customer we very often talk to, as a customer that's looking to do something new, and they're not doing anything in that space at the moment. So this is a net new investment. So really thinking about how would somebody like a CFO or somebody in finance look at this solution, and what would make them say, "Oh, okay, yes, that's how I want to. That's a good investment of the company's funds." Now, I think if you're in that situation where you're having to think about how do you get higher in the organization, you've almost missed the boat a little bit, because what you really want to be doing is talking in those terms from the very first time that you've met with that customer, which goes to, what is your marketing content stress? What sort of metrics are you baking in there that would be of interest to a CFO or a CIO or a CTO or a CISO, right? And it's about how are you going to market with your solution and your platform in a way that will resonate with those senior leaders that you're going to have to talk to at some point if you're going to be successful. So that's kind of two angles. There's the early way of doing it, there's the later way of doing it, but that's ultimately the destination I think you need to get to.
I love that. I think I really agree with the direction that you're taking this, which is there are not just different personas in the organization, but different types of engagements that we're having in the organization we're selling into. Some of them would be the technical people that have the day-to-day pain, and they actually care about the features. They care about the product. They want to solve their technical pain, right? Then you have the CFO who's maybe never met you, maybe will never meet you in the sales cycle, but somebody is going to talk to them and justify that purchase. And then you have the third, I think, engagement, which is the executives, the economic buyer, the executives of those technical people. So that, and it could be the CISO or the CIO or somebody who the technical person reports into, and they usually, right, in that example, would not report into the CFO, but the CFO will have a say. And so there are three types of conversations here. One is solving a technical pain to a persona. The other one is talking about the value and the business objectives of the economic buyer. And a third conversation is a conversation that we usually never have as sellers, but we arm our champion to go have that conversation. And that person, if they've not met you or not planning to meet you, then they're not going to fall in love with the solution. They're going to agree to the value. And it's sort of not an emotion.
And we've got to remember as sellers that there are going to be a lot of meetings that we're not in, and increasingly people who are looking to purchase a solution don't want to be sold to. They're going to go out and do their research. They're going to find communities, networking groups, analyst studies, marketing content, etc. And they're going to have figured out probably what they want to proceed with, or maybe there's one or two solutions that they want to proceed with. And that's when that you will hear from them. So the horse has very much gone through the gate and started coming up to speed. I wouldn't say it's necessarily bolted, but the horse is well on its way before you even potentially talk to this customer first. So you've got to be preparing for that moment and making sure that they're seeing your perspective on all three of those personas, the practitioner side, which I think most technology companies are very good at, the financial side, which is where, a value team can really help, but also the strategic side. I think it's important to remember that any technical solution is merely one part of a stack that's supporting this company's bigger and broader objectives. So I remember in a previous role, we were talking with a customer that was looking to replace some existing tools. But the key part of the value they saw was not that, we did A, B, C, and D, and E, and they only did A, B, and C. It was the fact that we were aligned to their future state technology architecture and could support their pivot from their legacy platform to their new architecture, which was there was some significant amount of growth, business growth associated with that. So we enabled them to pivot to this new strategy a lot more easily than the existing solution that they had. So I think there were some supporting numbers around FTEs avoided, etc. But really, the main narrative of the value message was we are the partner to help you through this big business transition. So that's an important part to mention as well.
Yeah, 100%. The alignment to the strategic objective, and so if we now look at specifically how we quantify that those business problems and solutions that we can bring to the market, and we try to focus on what is different in trying to quantify these problems in the cybersecurity space versus other spaces. And specifically, maybe you can say a word about what Sysdig does as well. But how does that happen when the value might be something tangible, might be sometimes something less tangible?
So Sysdig is a cloud native application protection platform. So if you think about modern technology architecture, born in the cloud, containerized, potentially probably multi-cloud, hybrid cloud, very diverse and complex architecture, Sysdig security platform is designed to support organizations that are leveraging that type of architecture. Typically, when you move to that type of architecture, you're using some legacy tools which are perfectly functional and capable for maybe on-premise or infrastructure as a service type cloud adoption. But waiting to get into the complexities of containerized architectures, microservices, there's a lot of other significant problems that challenge some of those other solutions. And Sysdig was architected for that world. Now, the challenge I've seen in cybersecurity that's made it so sort of interesting, and I still don't know that I've necessarily fully answered this question, to be honest, is if you think about a typical value engagement, right? What you're generally talking about is a customer has a problem or a pain that they're looking to solve. And the value engagement, the business value you're presenting is pretty much a variation of we're going to quantify the impact of the pain that you currently have or the way you're solving the problem today, including any ways where you're not maybe doing it as well as you want. And then we're going to show you the total cost of solving this problem with our solution. So it's sort of, in its very broadest sense, it's a TCO conversation. The total cost of fixing the pain or not fixing the pain today is this. And with this, in this new scenario, that cost is smaller. Now, the challenge I find with security is that unless you're factoring things like breach costs or ransomware attacks and the massive negative cost those events incur, I don't think that's actually what a value conversation is. You're not necessarily looking at reducing the cost of managing security, right? Yes, if you introduce sort of risk-adjusted breach costs, etc., you can kind of make it more of a financial conversation. But I would argue that most security leaders would kind of happily spend more money than they are today and have a negative ROI if they could demonstrably improve their company's security position and thereby reduce risk. So it's kind of a net increase in spend. If you're going to do more things in security and more effectively, you're probably expending more money on solutions and more money on people time to reduce your risk. And how do you measure that? That's where the challenge comes in. Yes, as you said, well, we can reduce the likelihood of a breach by 38%. According to the IBM cost of a breach study, if you do these things well, this risk goes down 38%. Okay, that's a way of measuring it that can make it a financial type conversation. In a lot of organizations, they hear that from every security vendor, quite honestly. I try to have that conversation in the sense of reducing the likelihood rather than eliminating a breach, because guess what? Nobody can eliminate breaches, unfortunately. The person that can will make a lot of money, but it's really around a risk reduction. It's a difficult conversation to have. How do you measure reducing risk? It's something that is ultimately very difficult to measure in a very scientific manner, which is in the values field, what we want to bring. That's the skill we want to bring to the table.
Right. And I think so from the conversations I've had with chief security officers about this is there are multiple lenses to this problem, to this value problem that they're trying to solve. One lens is reporting back to the board, what they've done with the investment that they were given. And so just like you said, showing amount of risk reduced or amount of coverage enhanced on the same budget shows the positive impact. But they also are very, very lean or stressed on their resources, as we know. And we know that there's never enough analysts and there's never enough people to go through all of your alerts and sort through the noise. And so when technology comes in and helps you become more efficient with the same risk profile, it solves an operational problem for the CISO. And so there's an operational lens looking inwards, and then there is an outward conversation reporting up to the board or to the management team. I was once in an advisory board room with CISO, and I've asked them, if you have $1 to spend, would you spend that on reducing risk or enhancing efficiency? And you would see the answers come back based on this lens, right? Based on what they really care about. And so when you look at this elusive risk reduction or coverage enhancement, let's get very tactical. How do you measure it? What are the metrics or type of measurements that you're making?
So I think we try and have a perspective where one of the challenges in the security field at the moment is how do CISOs talk to their board and their leadership in quantified ways. I think there's a real gap there. A typical board would say things like, are we secure? And, when you're in the field, question is kind of meaningless. Well, what does that mean? Are we secure? So helping a customer figure out in their unique circumstances, right? There's no one size fits all. How can they measure and benchmark where they are today and show that they've improved, right? Because ultimately that's what a CISO wants to do, is show I'm being fiscally prudent with the company resources and I am impacting our overall risk in these ways. So there's sort of a maturity that comes into play. The first level is coverage, right? Not just breadth of coverage, like is every node in my environment have some sort of protection on it? That's fairly basic. If it doesn't, then, well, yeah, you need to go fix that right now. But it's also a breadth of coverage, right? If you've got a solution that can detect a crypto miner in your environment, that's great. But if you have a solution that can detect 97% of MITRE attacks, that's even better, right? So there's a breadth of coverage that comes into play as well. And then I think a lot of it comes into prioritization, right? You allude to the fact that most security teams are overworked and understaffed, and nobody can go out and just hire people willy-nilly. So you've got to look at how do I make the most effective use of resources? And that comes down to prioritization. What type of alerts are we working on? Can we eliminate alerts altogether through noise reduction? Whether that's through having a rules engine that's very, very tunable, whether it's a threat feed that you can purchase from a vendor that's already been very tightly tuned and curated so that you don't get those noisy alerts in the first place. That's a fantastic outcome. And measuring not just that it's better now than it was before, but what about next week? What about 3 quarters from now? What about a year from now? That we're on an improving trend for reducing noise, because nobody wants to work on false positives. There's then severity and prioritization. The alerts that are valid, I want to work on the most impactful ones, right? If there's some alert related, high, medium alert related to an application that's not got any PII data in it, that's predominantly internally focused, that's not as important as this alert of maybe the same severity for my main production customer facing application that has millions or billions of dollars of revenue in it, right? So being able to focus on, okay, these are the biggest risks that I can focus on now, and how do you measure that? What's the proportion of critical alerts that I'm working on? What's the burn down rate of things like vulnerabilities, right? What's the mean open vulnerability age, right? Statistically analyzing, vulnerabilities constantly go up and down, and that's another thing that kind of complicates this whole conversation. Is in the security field, this isn't a case of I'm at this size today and I'm going to be at that size tomorrow. The day before Log4j came out, a lot of companies were probably pretty happy with their vulnerability management program, and the next day the world fell apart, right? Because there's this huge spike in things you have to fix. So it's not about, like, in many cases, it's not just pure number of alerts, but it's given that those things are going to vary over time. How do you actually measure that you're being more effective down the line than you were? And some of those statistical methods that I think Rich Sciason did some work on in a couple of his books around how do you actually bring some of that kind of quant type mentality to actually measure these things in black and white numbers, right? And different customers are going to want to measure different things, but the important thing is that a customer agrees on a number or a set of numbers is a good thing to measure their overall security, and that then you can measure to that. And that's what gives that CISO the kind of the language and the currency to discuss with leadership, to demonstrate how we're actually improving risk.
And if we dissect this to the type of people the CISO needs to justify this to, so the CISO would go up to the CIO, or if they report directly to the CEO, then the CEO. Usually it's the CIO, but they're also going to go to the CFO, as we said, and they're going to have a financial conversation. So what are how do you highlight the right metrics? Because we know the CISOs, they have a challenge on their own to justify value. Even if you give them that business case or BVA, they need to know how to deliver it, right? They need to know how to highlight it. So
Exactly.
what are the nuances and the highlights they would give to somebody who is very close to the security office versus somebody who's completely oblivion to what security is, but they want to know there's value here, and we need to simplify that conversation for them, like the board or the CFO or people that are further out.
And I think this is why, it's really important to have that value conversation early. And a lot of times when I first speak to a customer or a prospect, I'll share some sort of examples of how we've got companies before and what our value framework is and what our opinion is. A lot of times when a customer wants to hear what a vendor's opinion is, right? If you're a leader in a space, you should have an opinion based on what you see at your other customers. But what I'm trying to get to there is to get them to open up and lean in to say, what is their business case look like? We know what, a lot of times we think it's our business case. It kind of isn't. It's the customers, right? Because as you said, they're going to go and try to sell this internally. You will definitely you want to make it something that's very tuned to their business reality. Like that example I mentioned, where a customer was pivoting from being a commercial solution to a platform as a service. That was their business transition that was critical for them to support. And a lot of times, like to think there's a few kind of little voices in my head when I'm going through a value engagement that kind of trigger me to think, am I asking the right questions? And one of them is a BVA, a value assessment, is actually kind of a financial analysis of two alternate views of the future. One where you work with us, and one where you don't. And that's either maybe you continue with current state, or maybe you don't do anything at all, or there's another solution or another way of solving the problem. And what you're trying to do in the BVA is kind of level that playing field to say, well, if you went this route, your risk is higher. You'll need to hire more people to handle noisy alerts. There's an increased risk of our environment being breached, whatever that might be. That sort of, this is the kind of the why now type pain that we need to do something for. You want to say, let's make this an apples to apples comparison to say, well, you can do this. That, to sort of put it simply, we'd have to double the size of the security team because this other way of solving it with our legacy tooling would produce double the alerts.
Right.
Okay, so we can do that. We can absolutely do that and get to the same point. What you've got to try and avoid is, well, I could just do nothing and not spend any software, or I could buy your software. I mean, that's a really easy conversation for a CFO to have, right? If there's a do nothing, then what's the implication of that?
Right.
we will likely be breached to the tune of X million dollars or whatever it is. And being able to tell that narrative to the appropriate person using their language. So the CFO is going to want to say, I'm giving you X funding for this solution. What do I get for it? And
Right.
a technical narrative of use cases is not going to cut it in that situation. There needs to be some business impact, and it's not an easy conversation.
I think there's a separate discussion to be had on not just how do you create these assets, but how do you deliver them. I think that's a whole different discussion. Maybe last question here, which is more about the cybersecurity space and where it's heading. When you look at the big trends of agentic AI and how they're impacting the vendors in cybersecurity, how is that going to change the value conversation and the type of assets that you create as a value expert?
I think, AI for me is a force multiplier. And that's actually a term I try to use quite a bit when we're working on an engagement. Is one of the ways that you can express to somebody in a leadership position, finance, etc., to express the benefits of your solution is, if you've got a 2-person security team, Sysdig can help those 2 people do the work of 4.5 people, right? It's a 200% force multiplier. So, the implication being, if we did it another way, we'd have to go hire 2 more people. So that's
Right.
one way of doing it. What we've been trying to look at with some of our AI capabilities is that same sort of force multiplier, right? You've got that inherent intelligence that's when a practitioner comes in and sees the list of alerts, AI is helping them do that prioritization more quickly. So it's almost like having an extra person or 2 people on the team. So I think there's that force multiplier effect, but I think there's also the upskilling, where if you would assume that, and typical alert flow is it goes to a level 1 analyst who will learn potentially a subset is escalated to level 2, subset escalate to level 3, and so on for however many levels you have. And what AI is able to do is help you fix more issues, fix more alerts at the lower level, i.e., the lower, the least cost, lower cost resource. So if you can extrapolate that, and that can be a significant percentage of those alerts, then for those alerts that now get resolved at level 1 instead of level 2, there's a delta in productivity cost in doing that. So I think that's the other way that AI can help. It's the upskilling, helping same number of people do the work of more people, but then also don't have to bump as many alerts up to those more expensive resources, and there's productivity gains to be had there.
David, thank you so much for this conversation. I think this is a fascinating topic. We could talk about this for a lot more. We're actually going to have more episodes specifically around value selling in cybersecurity, both on operational excellence as well as value specific value management. So thank you so much for opening that series, David.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Roy. I'm looking forward to the other episodes as well. It's a big problem we're all looking to solve. So looking forward to hearing other thoughts on the topic as well. And thanks for the time.
Thank you. Bye.